The story of the Crusades does not begin in 1095. It starts much earlier, in a world divided by faith and power. To understand why thousands of Europeans marched to the Holy Land, we must look at the map around the year 1100. For centuries, two great civilizations had been pushing against each other. In the West, a collection of Christian kingdoms was slowly forming into what we now call Europe. In the East, a powerful and expanding Islamic world stretched from Spain to the borders of India. These were not distant neighbors. They were in constant contact, through trade, through scholarship, and most importantly, through conflict. The Mediterranean Sea was not a barrier. It was a frontier, a battleground where navies clashed and coastlines were raided. This was not a new situation. The tension had been building for over 400 years. By the 11th century, a sense of unease had settled over many Christian lands. Jerusalem was no longer under Christian rule. Antioch was no longer under Christian rule. Alexandria was no longer under Christian rule. The Byzantine Empire, the powerful eastern remnant of the Roman Empire, was shrinking. It had lost vast territories in North Africa. It had lost vast territories in the Levant. Now, new powers were rising in the east, threatening the heartland of Byzantium itself. In Spain, Christian kingdoms were locked in a long, slow struggle to retake lands that had been conquered by Muslim armies generations ago. This context is crucial. The popular image of the Crusades often portrays them as an unprovoked attack by an aggressive Christian Europe on a peaceful Muslim world. This essay will argue that this view is too simple. The evidence suggests a different story. The First Crusade was framed and largely understood at the time as a defensive reaction. It was a response to centuries of military expansion that had conquered Christian territories. It displaced Christian populations. It now threatened the remaining Christian states. This was not just about religion. It was about land, power, and a growing sense of a civilization under pressure from a determined and successful rival. Therefore, our central claim is this: the Crusades, particularly the First Crusade, were a direct and delayed response to more than 4 centuries of Islamic conquests. European leaders and ordinary people saw themselves as pushing back, not simply attacking. They believed they were undertaking a holy mission to reclaim what had been lost and to protect what remained. This perspective does not excuse the violence or brutality of the Crusades. It does not simplify the mixed motives of those who participated. It does, however, provide a necessary historical framework. It helps us understand the world as they saw it, a world where their faith and their land seemed to be on the defensive. The story of the pressure on Christian Europe begins not in the 11th century, but in the 7th. It starts in the Arabian Peninsula shortly after the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632. What followed was a period of astonishingly rapid military expansion under the first 4 caliphs, known as the Rashidun. This was not a slow migration, it was a swift and decisive series of conquests. Within a decade, the armies broke out of Arabia and shattered 2 great powers: the Byzantine Empire, the Sasanian Persian Empire. The speed of conquest sent shockwaves across the known world, redrawing the map of power and faith. The first Christian territories to fall: Syria-Palestine. Byzantine armies, exhausted from long wars with Persia, were defeated in key battles like Yarmouk in 636. That victory opened the path to the entire Levant. The holy city of Jerusalem, a focal point of Christian pilgrimage for centuries, surrendered to Caliph Umar in 637. This was a hugely significant event. While Christian worship was generally permitted to continue upon payment of a tax, the city was now under new political and military control. For Christians in faraway Europe, the news that the site of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection was in the hands of a rival faith was deeply unsettling, a fact that would echo for generations to come. Next, the focus turned to Egypt, the breadbasket of the Byzantine Empire and a historic center of Christian theology. The conquest was again remarkably fast. The city of Alexandria, a beacon of learning and one of the great patriarchates of the Christian Church, fell in 642. This loss was a devastating blow to Byzantium. It deprived the empire of immense wealth, grain supplies, and a major naval base. The loss of Egypt, coupled with Syria and Palestine, meant that 3 of the 5 ancient patriarchates of the Christian Church, Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, were now under the rule of the Islamic Caliphate. This left only Rome and Constantinople within Christian-controlled territory, a stark illustration of the shifting balance of power. This initial wave of conquest established a new reality. The southern and eastern shores of the Mediterranean, which had been part of the Roman and then Byzantine Christian world for centuries, were now part of a new and confident Islamic empire. This was not a raid or a temporary occupation. It was a permanent political and religious transformation. The Rashidun Caliphate had secured vast territories, rich resources, and diverse populations. For the Christian world, this was the beginning of a long period of contraction. The frontiers of Christendom had been rolled back dramatically, and the stage was set for centuries of ongoing conflict as these 2 powerful civilizations continued to press against each other. Following the Rashidun period, the Umayyad Caliphate came to power in 661 and continued the expansion with relentless energy. Their ambition was not just to consolidate previous gains, but to push the borders of the Islamic Empire even further. They established their capital at Damascus in Syria, a strategic launch point for campaigns east and for campaigns west. Under the Umayyads, the conflict evolved. It became about building a permanent, expanding state that directly challenged other Christian powers. The main rivals were the Byzantine Empire in the east and the fractured Visigothic kingdom in Spain. This was a systematic and organized effort to expand their domain. The Umayyad push westward was dramatic. Armies crossed North Africa. Cities like Carthage were conquered and destroyed, and the new city of Tunis was built nearby. By the early 8th century, the entire North African coast, from Egypt to the Atlantic, was under Muslim rule. This conquest changed the culture and administration of the region. Local Berbers gradually converted to Islam and were folded into Umayyad armies, adding manpower for the push into Europe. In 711, an army of Arabs and an army of Berbers crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and landed in Spain. The weak Visigothic kingdom collapsed quickly. Within a few years, most of the Iberian Peninsula became Muslim-controlled Al-Andalus. Umayyad forces pushed north over the Pyrenees into Frankish lands, raiding deep and sacking monasteries. The northward advance was halted in 732 at the Battle of Tours by Charles Martel, but raids along the Spanish frontier continued for centuries. Conquered Christians and Jews were designated as dhimmi, protected people. They could practice their religion, but they paid the jizya tax, could not build new churches without permission, and faced social and legal limits. The system allowed relative tolerance yet formalized a second-class status for non-Muslims, a reminder of Umayyad political and military dominance. While the Umayyads pushed west, they did not neglect the Eastern Front. The Byzantine Empire, the most powerful Christian state of the era, remained their primary rival. The Umayyads saw the capture of Constantinople, the Byzantine capital, as the ultimate prize. The city was not just a strategic fortress, it was the second Rome, the heart of Orthodox Christianity, a symbol of imperial endurance. The Caliphate launched 2 massive direct sieges against the city, Siege 674-678, Siege 717-718. Both were enormous undertakings, involving huge armies and navies. They represented a direct existential threat to the Byzantine state. The survival of the city was a testament to its formidable defenses and naval power. Although Constantinople itself held firm, the empire was under constant pressure. The loss of Syria and Egypt had been catastrophic, but the fight now moved into Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, the empire's core recruiting ground and agricultural heartland. Throughout the 8th and 9th centuries, the frontier between the Byzantine Empire and the Caliphate was a zone of perpetual warfare. Arab armies launched annual raids, known as Sawaif, deep into Anatolian territory. These were not attempts at permanent conquest, but campaigns of attrition. They aimed to plunder wealth, take captives, and devastate the land. These raids weakened the empire's ability to fight back and demoralized its population. This relentless raiding had a profound effect on Byzantine society. The frontier provinces became heavily militarized, and life was precarious. Peasants and townspeople lived under the constant threat of attack. This created a deep-seated defensive mindset within the empire. The Byzantines saw themselves as the shield of Christendom, standing alone against a powerful and aggressive foe. Their emperors were not just rulers, they were warrior commanders leading their armies in a sacred struggle for survival. This long fight shaped their identity and their diplomacy. It was a primary reason they would later look to their fellow Christians in the West for support, even though they were separated by religious disputes. By the 10th century, the Byzantine Empire experienced a period of resurgence. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had succeeded the Umayyads, was beginning to fragment, allowing Byzantine armies to go on the offensive. They managed to push the frontier east and recapture some territories, including the important city of Antioch in 969. However, this recovery was temporary. It did not erase the memory of centuries of defensive warfare, nor did it change the fundamental strategic reality. The empire was still vulnerable, and a new and even more formidable threat was gathering in the east. The long struggle had drained Byzantine resources and left it exposed to the next wave of invaders. Just as the Byzantine Empire was enjoying a brief military revival in the mid-11th century, a new and formidable power emerged from Central Asia, the Seljuk Turks. Originally nomadic warriors, they converted to Sunni Islam and they swept into the Middle East. They were skilled horsemen, fierce fighters, and they quickly established themselves as the new dominant force in the region. In 1055, they captured Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. They kept the Abbasid Caliph as a figurehead, while the Seljuk Sultan now held the real military and political power. Their arrival marked a dramatic shift in the political landscape and created a new, aggressive threat on the borders of the Byzantine Empire. Unlike the Arab dynasties that had become more settled and pragmatic over time, the Seljuks were a young and expansionist power. They were driven by a desire for new lands for their nomadic followers and a reinvigorated sense of religious purpose. They began to push relentlessly into Byzantine Anatolia, which had been the empire's most stable and vital province. This was a different kind of warfare than the earlier Arab raids. The Seljuks were not just plundering and retreating, they were migrating with their families, migrating with their herds, seeking to permanently occupy the land. This put immense pressure on the Byzantine frontier defenses, which were not prepared for this type of nomadic invasion. The decisive turning point came in 1071 at the Battle of Manzikert. Emperor Romanos IV, or Diogenes, led a large army into eastern Anatolia to confront the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan and push the invaders back. The battle was a catastrophic defeat for the Byzantines. Emperor Romanos himself was captured, a humiliation from which the empire's prestige never fully recovered. The defeat at Manzikert was not just a military loss, it was a political disaster. The Byzantine army was shattered, and with the emperor captured, the empire plunged into a decade of civil war as various generals vied for the throne. This internal chaos left the frontiers of Anatolia almost completely undefended. In the years following Manzikert, the floodgates opened. Turkish tribes poured into Anatolia, seizing town after town with little resistance. Within 2 decades, the Byzantines had lost almost the entirety of this vast and crucial territory. The Seljuks established their own state, the Sultanate of Rum, with its capital at Nicaea, less than 100 miles from Constantinople. This was an existential crisis of the highest order. The empire had lost its primary source of soldiers and lost its food supplies. It was now a coastal state clinging to survival, with a hostile power camped right on its doorstep. It was this desperate situation that led Alexios III to send his appeal for military aid to the west, an appeal that would ultimately trigger the First Crusade. By 1095, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos was in a desperate position. After years of civil war and relentless Turkish advances, he had managed to stabilize the situation somewhat. He consolidated his rule and fought back where he could. However, he knew his own resources were insufficient to reclaim the lost heartland of Anatolia. The empire simply lacked the manpower to mount a major offensive against the Seljuks. Facing this grim reality, Alexios made a fateful decision. He decided to turn to the Christian powers of Western Europe for help. He needed professional, heavy cavalry, the Knights of the West, to serve as mercenaries, to bolster his own depleted armies. This was not an easy decision. The relationship between the Latin Church of Rome and the Greek Orthodox Church of Constantinople had been strained for centuries. Tensions over doctrine, authority, and practice. Those tensions culminated in the Great Schism of 1054. The leaders of the two churches had formally excommunicated each other. There was significant mistrust and cultural misunderstanding on both sides. The Byzantines often viewed the Westerners as unsophisticated and barbaric, while many in the West saw the Byzantines as effeminate and untrustworthy. For Alexios to overlook these divisions and ask for aid shows how desperate the crisis was. The threat from the Seljuks was so great, he was willing to seek help from estranged religious rivals. In the spring of 1095, Alexios sent ambassadors to a church council at Piacenza. The envoys delivered a powerful, carefully crafted message. They described the relentless advance of the Turks and the loss of vast Christian territories. They highlighted the suffering of Eastern Christians and the threat now looming over Constantinople itself, the last great bastion of Christianity in the East. According to chroniclers, they warned that if Constantinople fell, all of Europe would be in danger. They appealed for military assistance, asking Western knights to come and fight for the emperor. Alexios' request was likely for a manageable contingent of elite mercenary knights, men who would fight under his command for pay. However, his appeal would be received and reinterpreted by Pope Urban II in a way Alexios could never have anticipated. Later that year, in November 1095, Urban called a great council at Clermont in France. At the conclusion of the council, he stepped out into an open field to address a huge crowd. There, he delivered one of the most influential speeches in history. He began by echoing the themes of the Byzantine appeal, describing the suffering of Christians in the East and the desecration of holy places. He spoke of Turkish invaders who had conquered the lands of the Greeks and were advancing toward Constantinople. He painted a vivid picture of a Christian world under attack, framing the conflict not as politics, but as a sacred duty. But Urban went further than Alexios had intended. He did not just call for mercenaries to help the emperor. He called for a great armed pilgrimage to liberate Jerusalem itself. He addressed the knights directly. He told them to stop fighting each other and to turn their swords against the enemies of God. He framed this new kind of war as a penitential act, an opportunity for sinners to earn a spiritual reward. Most powerfully, he offered a plenary indulgence, complete remission of temporal punishments for confessed sins to anyone who took the vow. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The crowd was electrified. As the Pope finished speaking, cries of Deus vult, God wills it, erupted. Knights surged forward, nobles surged forward, commoners surged forward. They sewed crosses onto their garments as a symbol of commitment. The emperor had asked for a few regiments of knights. The Pope had unleashed a human avalanche. The First Crusade had begun. He had provided the kindling. The Pope was about to provide the spark that would set the world ablaze. Section 1. The People's Fury. An uncontrolled beginning. Pope Urban's call at Clermont in 1095 was intended for the knights and nobles of Europe, the professional warrior class. However, his message spread far faster and wider than he could have anticipated. It ignited a fire not just among the aristocracy, but among the common people as well. Charismatic preachers amplified the call, most famously, Peter the Hermit. They traveled through the villages of France and through the villages of Germany. Their passionate sermons resonated deeply with peasants, laborers, and the poor. They saw the crusade as a chance for spiritual salvation and an escape from daily hardship. This resulted in an unexpected and chaotic first wave, often called the People's Crusade. Long before the main armies of the princes were ready to depart, massive disorganized bands of commoners began their journey east. They were poorly armed, they lacked provisions, and they had no real military leadership or discipline. Driven by fervent piety and a belief that God would provide, they set out on the long trek across Europe. It was a raw, spontaneous explosion of popular religious enthusiasm. The journey of the People's Crusade was marked by disaster. As these vast crowds moved through the Rhineland, their religious fervor turned violent against an enemy closer to home: Jewish communities. Worms, Mainz, Cologne. Crusaders killed thousands, despite attempts by local bishops to protect them. As the bands proceeded into Hungary and the Balkans, their lack of supplies forced them to plunder the countryside for food. This brought them into conflict with local populations and Byzantine authorities. When the remnants finally arrived at Constantinople, Emperor Alexios was appalled. This was not the elite force of knights he had requested. He saw a starving, unruly rabble. Eager to be rid of them, he ferried them across the Bosphorus into Anatolia, advising them to wait for the main princely armies. The Crusaders ignored his advice and pushed into Seljuk territory. They were almost immediately ambushed and annihilated by a Turkish army near a place called Sivito in October 1096. The People's Crusade ended in a catastrophic failure, a bloody prelude that demonstrated the dangers of zeal without discipline. Section 2. The Prince's March. A disciplined force emerges. While the People's Crusade met its grim fate, the main military force of the First Crusade was gathering as planned. This was the army of the great lords and princes of Western Europe, the professional warriors Pope Urban had originally targeted. Among the most prominent leaders, Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, Baldwin of Boulogne, Raymond IV, Count of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, Adhemar of Le Puy, the papal legate. These leaders represented a mix of motives. Men like Godfrey and Raymond were deeply pious. They invested enormous personal fortunes to fund their armies. By contrast, Bohemond was pragmatic and opportunistic. As a Norman prince, he wanted land, a principality in the east. The prince's armies traveled to Constantinople by different routes, arriving between autumn 1096 and spring 1097. This was the force Emperor Alexios had awaited: thousands of elite, heavily armored knights. The scale and power caused great anxiety for the emperor. He had asked for mercenaries under his command, but instead independent armies arrived, each with its own powerful leader. He now faced the immense challenge of managing them and protecting Byzantine interests. The arrival of the Prince's Crusade marked the true start of the military campaign. This was not a disorganized pilgrimage. It was a formidable invasion force, perhaps the largest Europe had seen in centuries. Its success depended on navigating treacherous politics, maintaining fragile unity among rival leaders, and surviving immense logistical challenges. The initial defensive aim to aid Byzantium was now fused with the grander goal of conquering the Holy Land for Latin Christendom. Section 3. A difficult alliance. Crusaders and Byzantines at Constantinople. The convergence of the Crusader armies at Constantinople in 1097 created a tense and complex diplomatic situation. Emperor Alexios III was both impressed and deeply worried by the massive force camped outside his capital's walls. He saw the military potential of the Western Knights, but he also saw the danger posed by their independent and ambitious leaders, especially his old enemy, Bohemond of Taranto. Alexios's primary goal was to use these armies to recover his lost Anatolian territories. He needed to bind the Crusaders to his own strategic objectives and prevent them from carving out independent kingdoms on lands he considered rightfully Byzantine. To manage the situation, Alexios used diplomacy, lavish gifts, and subtle pressure. He met with each of the Crusader leaders individually, trying to win their trust and secure their loyalty. His central demand was that they swear an oath of fealty to him. The oath required that any former Byzantine territories reconquered from the Turks be returned to imperial control. In exchange, Alexios promised supplies, logistical support, and a contingent of his own troops. The Crusader princes were deeply suspicious of this demand. They had not undertaken this perilous journey simply to become vassals of the Byzantine emperor. They viewed themselves as soldiers of Christ on a mission sanctioned by the Pope, not as mercenaries in Alexios's army. After negotiation, maneuvering, and a few veiled threats, most leaders, including Bohemond, reluctantly swore the oath. This agreement formed the fragile basis of their alliance. Alexios then transported the Crusader armies across the water into Anatolia. Their joint military operations began, but the alliance was fraught with mistrust from the start. The Crusaders saw Alexios as manipulative and untrustworthy, while Alexios and his court viewed the Westerners as greedy, unreliable, and potentially more dangerous than the Turks. This cultural and political divide would have major consequences for the rest of the campaign. The initial premise of a united Christian front against a common foe was already being complicated by the competing agendas of the Crusaders and their supposed Byzantine allies. The first major test of the Crusader-Byzantine alliance came at the city of Nicaea in May 1097. The capital of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, its capture was a crucial first step in reclaiming Anatolia. The Crusaders besieged the heavily fortified city, launching repeated assaults on its walls. The fighting was fierce. The siege dragged on for over a month. Preparing for a final decisive attack, they awoke to find Byzantine standards flying from the city's towers. Alexios feared the Crusaders would sack the city, so he conducted secret negotiations with the Turkish defenders, who agreed to surrender directly to him. The incident infuriated many Crusader leaders. They felt cheated out of the plunder and the glory of capturing the city themselves. It deepened their suspicion that Alexios was using them as pawns. Despite the friction, the victory was strategically vital. Nicaea's fall opened the road into Anatolia and struck a major blow to Seljuk power. The Crusaders marched south and fought a major pitched battle at Dorylaeum. The discipline of the heavy cavalry overcame the mobile tactics of the Turkish horse archers. The victory confirmed the effectiveness of Western knights and cleared the path for a long, arduous march across the arid Anatolian plateau. The march proved more formidable than any single battle. The Seljuks adopted a scorched earth policy, destroying crops and poisoning wells ahead of the Crusaders. The summer heat was brutal. The army soon began to run out of food and water. Men and horses died in huge numbers from starvation, thirst, and exhaustion. The campaign became a desperate struggle for survival. The ordeal stripped away romantic notions of warfare. It was a brutal slog that tested the faith and the endurance of every soldier. Daily need for sustenance temporarily eclipsed the Crusades' lofty goals. During this desperate march, the first major split occurred. The main army continued slowly south toward Syria, while Baldwin of Boulogne took a small contingent and broke away. He headed east into Edessa, a region with a large Armenian Christian population. Seeing an opportunity, he involved himself in local politics, was adopted as heir by the local Armenian ruler, and soon took control of the city. In 1098, he established the county of Edessa, the first of the Crusader states. It was an act of opportunism, a departure from the goal of reaching Jerusalem, and a violation of the oath sworn to Alexios. It would reshape the Crusades' course in ways few could have predicted. After the grueling march across Anatolia, the main Crusader army arrived before the walls of Antioch. In October 1097, this ancient city, one of the original patriarchates of Christianity, was a massive strategic prize. It was heavily fortified, well garrisoned, a formidable obstacle on the road to Jerusalem. The ensuing siege would become the longest and most difficult of the entire crusade, lasting for nearly 8 grueling months. The Crusaders were unprepared for such a long investment. As winter set in, their situation became desperate. Famine once again ravaged the camp, and morale plummeted. Many knights deserted, believing the cause was lost. The army seemed on the verge of complete collapse. The city finally fell in June 1098, not through force of arms, but through betrayal. Bohemond of Taranto, ever the opportunist, had been secretly negotiating with a disgruntled Armenian captain of one of the city's towers, in exchange for the promise of being made prince of the city. The captain agreed to let Bohemond's men scale the walls in a daring night attack. A small group of Norman knights entered the city, opened the gates, and the Crusader army poured in. What followed was a brutal sack, with the starving and enraged Crusaders massacring the city's Muslim inhabitants. Bohemond immediately made good on his claim, seizing control of Antioch for himself, refusing to hand it over to the Byzantine representative, citing the emperor's failure to provide adequate support as a breach of their agreement. The Crusaders' victory was almost immediately overturned. Just days after they had taken the city, a massive Muslim relief army arrived, led by the powerful ruler Kerboga of Mosul, and trapped them inside. Now the besiegers became the besieged. Their situation was even more desperate than before. Starved and exhausted, they were trapped in a ruined city with a powerful enemy army outside the walls. All hope seemed lost. It was at this moment of absolute despair that a poor pilgrim named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have had a vision, revealing the location of the Holy Lance, the spear that had pierced the side of Christ on the cross. After some digging in the city's cathedral, a lance head was indeed found. Whether the discovery was genuine or a brilliant feat of psychological warfare, its effect was electrifying. The discovery of the relic was seen as a sign of God's favor, a miracle that completely revitalized the Crusaders' morale. With their faith restored, they decided on an incredibly bold gamble. On June 28, 1098, the starving Crusader army marched out of the city gates and launched a desperate, all-or-nothing attack on Kerboga's much larger force. Against all odds, the Crusader charge shattered the Muslim army, which was weakened by internal divisions among its emirs. The miraculous victory at Antioch secured the city for Bohemond and cleared the final major obstacle on the road to Jerusalem. After the long delay at Antioch, the remaining Crusader army, reduced by battle, reduced by disease, garrisons left behind in Edessa, garrisons left behind in Antioch, began the final leg of its journey. The march south through Palestine was relatively swift. Many local rulers chose to offer supplies rather than fight. On June 7, 1099, nearly 3 years after leaving Europe, they finally laid eyes on Jerusalem. Many hardened knights wept and fell to their knees to give thanks. The city was held by the Egyptian Fatimid Caliphate, recently retaken from the Seljuks. The Crusaders laid siege, but Jerusalem was well defended. They lacked siege equipment and, crucially, water. The countryside had been stripped of wood and food. For over a month, the army suffered under the hot sun. Religious ecstasy turned to desperation. Leaders organized a barefoot penitential procession around the walls, collective prayer and rededication, which boosted morale and unified the army. The final assault began on the night of July 14, 1099. They constructed 2 large siege towers using wood brought from the coast. After a full day of desperate fighting, Godfrey's men got their tower against the northern wall. At noon on July 15th, a small group of knights climbed the ramparts. The defenses were breached. The gates opened, the army flooded into Jerusalem. What followed was an infamous medieval massacre. Driven by years of hardship and a fanatical belief in divine judgment, the Crusaders slaughtered Muslim inhabitants and the city's Jewish inhabitants. The capture was the bloody, triumphant culmination of the First Crusade. The original goal, response to centuries of Islamic expansion and a plea from a beleaguered Byzantine emperor, had been achieved and surpassed. They had not just defended Byzantium, they carved out their own states and reconquered the holiest city in Christendom. Godfrey of Bouillon was elected ruler. He refused the title of king and took the name Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was established, and the other Crusader states arose, creating a Latin Christian presence in the Levant, which would trigger a century of Muslim counteroffensives and a new phase in the long history of conflict. The story of the First Crusade, as the evidence shows, did not begin with a sudden European impulse for conquest in 1095. It began centuries earlier. It was a direct, if delayed, reaction to a long and sustained period of Islamic military expansion that had steadily consumed 2/3 of the Christian world. From the fall of Jerusalem in 637 to the catastrophic Byzantine defeat at Manzikert in 1071, Christian powers had been on the defensive. North Africa, Egypt, Spain, Anatolia created a profound sense of civilizational crisis. The final, desperate plea from Emperor Alexios I was not a strategic gambit. It was a cry for help from an empire on its knees, representing the culmination of 400 years of retreat and defeat. Pope Urban II's call to arms at Clermont was a masterful channeling of this accumulated pressure. He took the specific military request from Byzantium and transformed it into a grand, popular movement with a spiritual goal: the liberation of Jerusalem. This call resonated so powerfully because it tapped into pre-existing anxieties and traditions. The fear for the safety of pilgrims, the long tradition of holy war fought in Spain, and the deep piety of the age, all combined to create a volatile mixture. The resulting explosion of fervor, which caught even the Pope by surprise, was not an attack out of the blue. It was the breaking of a dam that had been under pressure for generations, unleashing a flood of military and religious energy from a European society that believed it was finally pushing back. However, to say the crusade was a reaction is not to simplify its nature. As the campaign unfolded, its initial defensive purpose became intertwined with other, more worldly ambitions. The establishment of the county of Edessa by Baldwin and the Principality of Antioch by Bohemond were clear acts of personal opportunism. These actions directly contradicted the oath sworn to Emperor Alexios and demonstrated how the quest for land and power quickly became a driving force. The initial aim of aiding a beleaguered Christian empire was soon overshadowed by the goal of carving out new Latin Christian states in the East. What began as a response evolved into an expansionist project in its own right, setting the stage for 2 centuries of further conflict. Therefore, the conclusion we must draw is a complex one. The First Crusade was fundamentally rooted in a reaction to long-term Islamic military success. The perception of a faith and a people under siege was real and was based on a long history of territorial loss. But this defensive motive was the catalyst, not the sole ingredient. As the armies marched east, a potent mix of piety, greed, and political ambition took over, transforming the expedition. It became a cascade of unforeseen consequences, permanently altering the relationship between East and West, and between the Christian and Islamic worlds. It was a response that took on a life of its own, with results that no one in 1095 could have possibly predicted. Acknowledging the long history of Islamic expansion before 1095 doesn't justify the Crusades, but it helps explain why they happened and why they exploded across the medieval world.